This is a very small piece of research. It's really just a conversation starter. But as you referenced in your intro, we really just wanted to have a look at this very particular bit of how China's operating in the region and how that's perceived by Pacific Island communities that really doesn't get a lot of attention. So given that we did do this research during COVID, it was a very different experience for me. Normally, when I do research in the Pacific, I hop on a plane and go and sit with people in their offices and in coffee shops. But this was done primarily as a desk study. And then we supplemented that with some one-to-one interviews that we did via Zoom, as everybody was doing at that time. So we managed to talk to 14 people across 4 different countries and also at the regional level. And as I say, just really opened the conversation about, well, how does this play? Does it get talked about? Who says what? And what might that mean for the future?
Yeah. So what is your early sense about what sort of conversation happens between China and Pacific nations?
Well, I think, as you know, part of the title of this piece of research that we're releasing tomorrow is Disconnected Discourses. And I think that was really what we were struck by, is that there are different conversations going on in different places. So there's a particular conversation that operates at the regional level, which is smaller in some ways, but is very much focused on climate change. Regional officials have climate change, whether it's mitigation, adaptation, climate finance. That's at the heart of the work that they do. At national level, when politicians are speaking with Chinese contractors or possibly Chinese diplomats, but usually it's Chinese contractors, it's much more transactional and it's much more focused on economic development. So these are the conversations that lead to projects that we're very familiar with in this context, infrastructure projects, whether it's a wharf or a bridge or a road. And that's very much the focus. And in those conversations, what seems to be the case is that climate change doesn't necessarily feature very highly in those conversations, and it only gets introduced, it only gets on the table if the Pacific interlocutors bring it. And then the Chinese side is likely to be responsive. But if the Pacific people don't mention climate change, then it possibly doesn't get mentioned at all.
So it would seem as if it's rather critical that if there is a infrastructure project that is going to go ahead that may impact in some way environmentally, that the conversation does happen from the very beginning.
Yes, and I think that we need to think again. It's quite a diverse, and it does vary from country to country. So, for example, Solomon Islands has a very new relationship with China, so that the immaturity of that relationship has a significant impact. Whereas when you look at countries like Fiji and possibly Vanuatu that have more established relationships, then maybe the tone and the nature of the conversation is different. But certainly and certainly from the civil society perspective, they have a very strong concern that political leaders and officials, but particularly political leaders, are not bringing the issue of the climate emergency or the climate crisis, they're not bringing that to the table soon enough or even at all. And they would argue that, yes, just as you said, this needs to be part of the criteria, part of the framework from the beginning, not sort of subsequently down the track as some sort of rectification aspect.
Yeah, sort of some add-on. It is interesting, you reference the Pacific Island Leaders Forum, PIF, as it's known, and it is often very critical of Australia and New Zealand for not mitigating climate change issues enough in the region. Does China get the same pushback?
I think, one of the things that we looked at was statements from organisations such as PIF and speeches made by people such as Prime Minister Bainimarama, who's the current chair of the PIF. And certainly there are plenty of instances where statements have been made or calls have been made that speak to China as a global emitter. Some of those statements are encompassing, so they might be addressed to the global community generally or the big emitters generally. But in some instances that we can point to, China has been singled out. And certainly it does seem to be the case that when China and India intervened late in the piece at COP26 to water down the text of the Glasgow Compact, that was a cause of concern for Pacific Island countries that are obviously, once they're on that global stage and all they're talking about is climate change, as we know, they are very vocal, they are very significant players in that space.
Yeah, and therefore they call them out in that more sort of acute moment. What has your observations been about how China comes to the support of our regional neighbours in terms of crises when there are, you know, when there are climate change related floods, hurricanes, cyclones?
Yeah, so this is a developing aspect of how China's engaging. Certainly, when we talk to Pacific Island people about what they perceive in that space, their memories or their impressions are very much steered towards the very visible aspects. So they remember Australian and New Zealand ships turning up or planes arriving from France or whatever else. China has been much less present in that space. The response to the earthquake, the submarine earthquake and tsunami in Tonga earlier this year was a marked departure. That was the first time we saw naval assets deployed by China as part of disaster response. Now, we don't know whether that means they're going to do that more often, but it wouldn't be surprising if they did. And obviously that then leads to this sense of, one of the things that we talk about is, where are the opportunities for cooperation? Is this an area in which, if China is going to play this sort of role, which is needed at the time, how can that be brought into a better coordinated sense of how partners support countries that are dealing with these disasters?
And which, you know, makes us think that really we need to have greater cooperation between China, Australia and even the US.
Well, that's right. And certainly not just in relation to climate change, but certainly in relation to climate change. Pacific Island leaders have called for a long time for greater cooperation and greater collaboration on the part of their development partners. Everybody says, whether it's China or the US or Australia, that what they're concerned about is supporting Pacific Island countries. So I guess this is an area where maybe we need to see, or we can hope to see, that there'll be a bit more walking the talk.
Yeah. Well, I hope it gets the conversation started as you hope, Tess, and that there's further research done. Great to have you on.
Thanks very much, Bev.